Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. On behalf of the Future Climate for Africa program, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to this learning session reflecting on effective approaches to research uptake and action. My name is Julio Araujo, and I'm a research fellow at SouthSouthNorth within the Coordination, Capacity Development and Knowledge Exchange Unit for FCFA, and I lead the Wiser Transform project, and I'm the co-lead for the Coordination Unit for the Adaptation Research Alliance. Just before we get started, there's a couple housekeeping notes. The session, as well as the breakouts, are going to be recorded. This will be made available on the FCFA website and will be sent out as part of the post-event communications. We've muted everyone by default, so there won't be any disruptions. Please make sure you remain on mute while others are talking, especially within the breakout sessions. For the speakers, a reminder will be sent out to you via the chat with the 1 minute left warning. If you have any questions or points you would like to make, please add them to the chat box in the bottom tab in the Zoom screen. And for any technical issues, please send a direct message to SouthSouthNorth in the chat box. Alternatively, you can email events@SouthSouthNorth. So the session today will run for 1 hour and 30 minutes. You can have a brief introduction, an intro to the Adaptation Research Alliance, and then presentations from FCFA, CARIAA, and CDKN. We'll then go into a breakout session for 30 minutes and then come back into plenary for a 25-minute feedback and Q&A. So a brief bit about FCFA. It's funded by the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and the Natural Environment Research Council. It's a research and development program that's generating fundamentally new climate science focused on Africa and piloting the use of improved medium to long-term climate information in development projects across West, East, Central, and Southern Africa. And a lot of the kind of generation for this and inspiration for this learning session comes from a report that we've recently developed. And through this report, we wanted to take stock of the lessons emerging from the FCFA collective experience and see how that might inform future investments into research on climate and development. We really focus on 3 themes: collective learning within the program and within the research teams, Southern leadership and capacity development, knowledge co-production and research uptake. There's a link on the screen, and we'll add a link of the report in the chat as well if you're interested. So the topic of this session is quite fitting because there are a number of programs that are being developed that would benefit from increased information on effective approaches to actioning research. And a significant gap still remains in understanding the effectiveness of current and previous approaches to research uptake. But we often find that there's no kind of single universal strategy or solution to promoting uptake of climate information, especially amongst a range of users and considering different contexts. So a significant issue emerging from this is identifying and monitoring the effectiveness of specific approaches with particular stakeholder groups. We often find that the project timelines are too short to adequately assess the impact, as this impact often comes after the projects are completed. This means it's extremely difficult to assess whether the best matches between tools, approaches, and a particular audience. In addition, there's often a poor monitoring of approaches during the project life, and therefore a need for designing effective processes to assess long-term impact as well as short-term impact. And I guess the greater question here is who's best placed to implement long-term monitoring and evaluation of impact after a project or program ends. So there are obviously many successful approaches to enhance research uptake, and it's important to also assess the program design functions that have constrained these approaches and processes. If we really want to improve the next generation of climate programs, we'll need to reflect critically on the success and failures of these approaches to research uptake and action, as well as the limiting factors of the program design. So in the session, we really want to interrogate this kind of overarching question, which is, what are the common strengths across the programs and projects that need to be taken forward? And in answering this question, we want to discuss what are we learning about effective approaches to research uptake and knowledge brokering? How can uptake and brokering be integrated into the very beginning of projects so that they don't face lag effects where impact happens after the project closes? And then what are the opportunities and limits of focusing on knowledge products as a means to achieve impact? Now, we have a really distinguished group of speakers today from the Adaptation Research Alliance, Future Climate for Africa, the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, and the Collaborative Adaptation Research Initiative in Africa and Asia. And I'm going to ask Rosalind to speak first with an introduction into a new initiative, the Adaptation Research Alliance. And Dr. Rosalind West is the lead climate science advisor at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. She is responsible for commissioning research on adaptation and resilience, including the Future Climate for Africa program. She's a member of the World Adaptation Science Program Steering Committee and co-chair of the Adaptation Research Alliance, which is under development for launch at COP26. So with that, Rosalind, over to you.
Thank you so much, Julio, and hello everybody. It's great to see so many people online and interested in this crucial topic of how we bring research into use. As Julio mentioned, I'm co-chairing the development of this Adaptation Research Alliance, along with my esteemed colleague, Professor Anand Patwardhan at the University of Maryland, who is the chair of the Scientific Steering Committee of the World Adaptation Science Programme. I think this is a very exciting initiative. We've had a lot of interest in it, and I think that it's really trying to tackle a big problem that this webinar is also trying to tackle. So let's just move on to the next slide quickly, because we don't have that much time. And I think that the fundamental part of this is perceiving the central role of knowledge in informing effective action. If we look back at the report of the Global Commission on Adaptation, that really called for 3 revolutions, starting with a revolution in understanding. And that's made up of understanding climate risks, making them visible and actionable, understanding the solutions, or what works to tackle those risks and reduce them, and crucially, co-creating those solutions with the people who will be using them, and understanding what works and learning by doing. And that learning is really part of what we're talking about today. And if we move on to the next slide, the cornerstone of this is really action-orientated research. And I think that through the programs that we're going to hear from now, from Future Climate for Africa, from CARIAA, and from CDKN, they have really demonstrated the benefit of action-orientated, user-centered research for bringing new knowledge into use. I think that what we need to do, and what the Alliance is calling for, is an increase in the focus on that action-orientated research. And I think if you look at this, the example I've got here comes from the AMA 2050 project of Future Climate for Africa, which looks at in West Africa. And you can see here that it's a combination of improving our understanding of risk. So here showing how crop yields in the Sahel have already decreased and are projected to decrease further. But that as risk information alone is not enough. We also need better decision making. And here we've got an example of a decision-making tool like this plateau game that's being played by peanut farmers to aid them to use and apply the risk information to inform their decision-making. And then also better practical solutions. Here we've got a nice example of some climate-resilient agriculture techniques that are being developed under the project. And I think that, crucially, the research that we're doing on adaptation and resilience is not just about defining the problem, but about finding solutions, and that comes through user-centered, action-orientated research. If we go to the next slide. So the COP26 coming up in November of next year provides a crucial moment for action on adaptation and resilience. And that action needs to be underpinned by research and evidence. And I think we really need to seize this opportunity of COP26 to underscore the centrality of research for understanding both what works and what doesn't, to ensure that our communities are resilient to the effects of climate change that are already locked in, no matter what we do to reduce future emissions. So the Adaptation Research Alliance is being developed as a coalition across the action and research communities, bringing together those communities to catalyse increased investment and increased capacity for action-orientated research, promoting research modalities and activities that are collaborative, that are Southern-led, that strengthen local universities and research institutes, and that lead to capacity building and facilitate those linkages between research and implementation at multiple levels. I think if we've only got a few seconds left, so I'll just skip ahead a couple of slides to slide 7, which explains the process that we're setting up to establish this alliance. So we have a steering board, we have 3 groups that are focusing on understanding the research mechanisms, understanding the commitments that we might be able to encourage partners to make to this alliance, and developing the governance structure of how it will function post-COP. And then if we move on to slide 9, so the next steps. So the first set of working group meetings have been held already. We're moving to the next set over the next few weeks, and the aim is to have a nice launch at the GCA summit in January. And if we go to the final slide, this development of this alliance is an open process across the whole community of people that are involved in research and action. And I think that the knowledge that we're going to gain today through our discussions of what works and what doesn't in bringing action into use is absolutely critical for informing the development of an effective alliance on adaptation research. So thanks very much, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. Now I'm going to hand over to Blane Harvey. Blane is an assistant professor and William Dawson Scholar at McGill University in Montreal in Canada. He's an interdisciplinary scholar who works across the social and natural sciences on the themes of learning, environmental change, and sustainable development. And he previously worked at ODI in London and IDRC and at the Institute of Development Studies. So over to you, Blane.
Thanks a lot, Julio, and thanks everyone for your participation in this. It's great to be kicking this off and to be sharing just a few insights from some of the work that we did looking at lessons emerging from the Future Climate for Africa program. So what I'll be showing you is really a very brief sort of highlight reel of some of the points that emerged in looking at research uptake and knowledge brokering strategies that were used in the Future Climate for Africa program, which many of you may be familiar with already. And we looked across really all of the consortia that were undertaking research within there, looking at about 20 examples of strategies and approaches that were used to engage with users or potential users of climate information and undertake strategies to broker that knowledge, translate it into different forms, make it available for uptake in decision making. So just moving to the next slide. One of the first questions that I wanted to tackle here, and obviously there's a lot more in the report that that Julio shared, but is first of all, how did these consortia engage with users? So next slide, please. You'll see that what we did to look at this was think about knowledge co-production, which is increasingly important within this this space, the climate information space, and the stages of knowledge co-production, which we see here in the graphic. And really what we found was a lot of initiatives are starting to take this approach. They're identifying actors and building partnerships, which involves building trust and connection with potential end users, then co-exploring those needs with end users using a range of strategies to do so, knowledge sharing, communicating the uncertainties that are associated with climate information, and so on. We have a lot of other examples in the report, but we're just showing you really the ones that were most common. And many of them then tried to co-develop and co-deliver solutions. Not all initiatives were trying to be co-productive in nature, but really knowledge mobilization tools and approaches were used to really understand and develop alongside users some of the responses. And finally, and I'll return to this at the end, a much more limited evidence of monitoring and evaluation of the results of that engagement. Next slide, please. So once that engagement has been going on, obviously some of the knowledge co-production strategies are in and of themselves tools for mobilizing knowledge. by doing co-production, you are mobilizing some of that knowledge. But that wasn't the only way that knowledge was being mobilized. On the next slide, what you'll see is that there were a wide range of tools, strategies that we found across this whole spectrum that some of you may be familiar with of knowledge brokering, whether that's playing a role of an information intermediary, so making sure that information is available, and we see a number of initiatives or examples of that. Translating knowledge into appropriate formats, whether those are policy briefs or mapping or screening tools and so on, to much more two-way strategies like knowledge brokering, which is really aimed at encouraging interaction between stakeholders. And innovation brokering, which is trying to really change fundamentally the system within which people are working, was much less prevalent, so that we saw less of that within the examples that we were looking at. So I'm going to wrap up just by looking at some of the, on the next slides, a couple of the lessons that emerged. And I'm sorry that this is brief, but as I say, the report contains a lot more detail on this. First of all, some of the key message that emerged around user engagement is this sort of cycle of knowledge co-production that I've just outlined for you is a useful guide for thinking about stages and thinking about strategies and steps, even if for programs, the aim is not to co-produce knowledge. And I would argue that it's not always important, or it's not always essential to be co-producing. It's a labor-intensive and a time-intensive process. And there may be instances where it's not necessary, or that's not the right moment to be doing it. When we talk about knowledge mobilization and packaging or repackaging knowledge for end users, as I note there, we have a wide range of strategies and tools. There's still a strong emphasis on providing and translating information. We may need a more focus on influencing wider decision-making systems, that innovation brokering function, which we didn't see emerge. And there are questions in our mind about whether you can do that in a time-bound program, because it is really such a long and drawn out process of trying to change the way systems function, for example, systems for using climate information. But what we do see is a really interesting interplay between engaging users and redeveloping information, or translating and mobilizing knowledge for those users. The most effective approaches that we saw are really tailored. They're non-linear. It's not just about building a report and communicating it to users, nor is it just about kind of engaging with users and asking them what they need. People are going back and forth between those stages. They're adapting as the relationship evolves, and these are really unfolding over longer periods of time. And this brings me to my last point, that our M&E data that's being gathered on engagement and mobilization is still very limited. The interplay that I've just described of going back and forth between users and co-development and mobilizing knowledge with them shows that we need to move beyond just counting outputs or counting knowledge products or whatever we're developing, and looking more at the longer term outcomes within these programs. But our strategies for doing so are really not sufficiently developed. This is an area for much more work as we move ahead. I'll stop there, and I look forward to talking to you more about this in the breakout groups.
Thank you very much, Blane. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Georgina Cundill Kemp. And Georgina is a Senior Program Officer at Canada's International Development Research Centre. She led the efforts to support program-wide learning and practice on research uptake in CARIAA, and has also supported the development of CDKN's approach to knowledge brokering in this new phase of that program, and continues to learn alongside that team. She is part of the joint IDRC FCDO team that's currently developing the CLARE program, the Climate Adaptation and Resilience program. And she's leading the development of the knowledge management and research uptake strategies for that program. So over to you, Georgina.
Thanks, Julia. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for a conversation that I think is very long overdue. So I'm really looking forward to this. I'm going to use my 5 minutes to really focus on the first of the three questions for this webinar. The first is, what are we learning about effective approaches? And the second, how do we integrate research uptake right into the beginning of programs? Next slide, please. So just for those of you who don't know CARIAA, this was a 7-year partnership between FCDO and IDRC. We funded five-year research programs that connected more than 450 researchers across more than 15 countries. There were more than 40 core institutional partners, and they were organized through 4 transdisciplinary networks, which we called consortia. Next slide, please. So research uptake actually was part of CARIAA right from the start. All of the consortia had to develop what we called research into use plans in their first year. But what a midterm evaluation told us was that there was a huge amount of variability with how consortia and research teams were using this idea of research into use. And very often they were confusing or conflating it with stakeholder engagement. And basically, if there was stakeholder engagement, they were ticking a box and saying that they were doing research into use, which we later began to call research for impact. And they recommended that we take far greater program level leadership to try and develop a common understanding of what research into use was, so that we could also generate learning across the program to support implementation for the remaining about 2.5 years. And our CARIAA was really set up to respond to that recommendation, because we had since the beginning invested in what we called collaborative spaces, things like thematic working groups, geographic working groups, where we had teams working in the same countries, specifically to support learning across the consortia. So what we did was to initiate a program level co-creation and learning process around research for impact that really resulted in a very active community of research into use leads across all 4 consortia, who met pretty much every 6 months at least for the remaining few years of the program. Next slide, please. One of the first things that we did was to ask ourselves, what do we understand research into use or research for impact to consist of? What are the essential activities? What are the practices that we are engaged in all of the projects? And this little framework was one of the first things that we generated, and it became a language that we could use to start to learn across these really diverse teams of practice and start to share lessons with one another. So the main point I'd like you to take from this slide is there's actually 6 bubbles here. Look carefully. It looks like there's 5, but there's a big one right in the middle. And what we learned in CARIAA is that research for impact requires all 6 of these activities simultaneously, although some teams put more emphasis on some rather than others. So right at the top is stakeholder engagement. One of the lessons in CARIAA is not any old stakeholder engagement that makes a difference. We're talking about sustained, ongoing relationships over time. And what we learned is that when you get that right, you better have credible, relevant, and contextualized evidence to then feed into that relationship. And co-production is one of the ways that we can develop that kind of evidence. It's not the only way. And then once you have that evidence, now I'm moving down to the bottom right, you have to have targeted, accessible, appropriate communication strategies. And when you start to get those 3 things right, move over to the left, you're going to start getting requests for capacity building from stakeholders. And when you start getting those kind of requests, now we're on the bottom left, novel partnerships between research organizations and practitioner organizations, civil society organizations can make all the difference to being able to respond to those kind of requests. And right in the center of it is monitoring and learning. There isn't a single impact in CARIAA that we could have predicted from the beginning. This kind of practice unfolds in complex situations where you simply have to be responsive to change, and so learning has to be at the center. Next slide, please. Now, to the question that was posed to us for this webinar, how do we integrate research uptake into the beginning of programs? I would say this is essential and we can do it, but if we don't pair that with a learning orientation that creates opportunities to improve our practice through the whole life course of a program, then we're not really going anywhere. So what this process in CARIAA did was create this sort of repertoire of practice, a sort of collection of activities that we could learn about together over time, but we have to invest in creating the opportunities for that learning to happen. Next slide, please. And if there's one last lesson I'll share with you, it's that research for impact requires dedicated and trained personnel. This is not something that we should assume that researchers have the buy-in for, the skills for, or that they are in institutions that have the incentives in place in order to support them to do this kind of work. But when we employ or invest in dedicated personnel does not exonerate researchers from the responsibility to work differently. And so we have to support them to do that. And part of it is capacity building for researchers, and not always thinking that there's people out there in the world who need capacity building. It's also inside our research teams. Last slide, please. If you'd like to learn more, we developed a massive open online course that was developed mainly by Jessie de Maria Kenny, that's hosted by the University of Cape Town, on our lessons. Our lessons across all of these activity areas are contained in that working paper on the top right. And actually Blane helped to develop a learning guide, which supports teams to integrate that huge big circle in the middle, which is really this monitoring and learning orientation to the practice of uptake. Thanks.
Thank you, Georgina. Next up is Shehnaaz Moosa. Shehnaaz is the director of the Climate and Development Knowledge Network program and is director at SouthSouthNorth. She's overseen SouthSouthNorth's Southern Africa Climate Finance Partnership Program since 2016, which is focused on improving climate finance access in Southern Africa. Previously, she was the African Regional Coordinator for CDKN and the Climate Resilience Lead for the Climate Resilient Infrastructure Development Facility, which is CRIDIF, which delivers small-scale water infrastructure in Southern Africa. She previously consulted on a range of projects to the public sector, including managing the National Strategy for Sustainable Development in South Africa. And just a request from some of the participants, Shehnaaz, perhaps if you can try talk as slowly as possible so that some of the second language English participants can hear the information a little bit better. So
cool. If I talk slower, Julio, do I get more time?
we can negotiate.
Yes. Thank you very much, Julio. It's an honor to be presenting on this platform, and I'm really grateful for all of you who are attending and spending your time listening to us. I'm Shehnaaz Moosa, as Julio said, and I'm the director of the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. It is a IDRC and Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs funded program, and it is run from SouthSouthNorth, but it's a partnership between ourselves, ICLEI South Asia, and FLA in Latin America. So what I'm going to be talking to you about is one aspect of knowledge brokering, and one that links very nicely with research into use, which is peer learning. So just some background quickly before we head into the peer learning bits. CDKN is based on 3 pillars. This is knowledge, engagement, and peer learning. Knowledge is about taking evidence or research and producing products that respond to a demand. Engagement is about ascertaining the demand, and peer learning is about bringing together countries and decision and policy makers to work on solutions that deliver climate action on the ground. Across all 3 pillars, we have capacity building. So the approach I'm going to talk to you about now is peer learning, because what we found in our program is that this was where there was a lot of demand. So in our engagement, there was a lot of demand for peer learning, but it also is the most impactful when you're wanting to take your research into actual use. What we found is that often people prefer to be linked to other people and experiences rather than just documents and tools and research papers. And so this is this bullet here, which for us was really what we worked around. We also found that when people work in particular situations, they understand the context and the issues being faced, and then sharing their learnings, and when needed, sourcing additional information from research that really results in embedded capacity building. Peer learning also results in a more detailed, so the level of detail you go down to and the specifics you get into are really rich when you're in a peer-to-peer environment. And it also fosters very much co-creation. It creates buy-in and commitment to go away, use what was learned and put it into action. We also find that in the context of the Global South, which is quite different to that of the North, the South to South peer learning has been exceptionally useful. It also creates then a global voice of leadership from the South for the South. And then also, obviously, there's the learning by doing, which is what the peer learning approach is about. Just quickly to run you through 5 options that we looked at when we were doing the peer learning. It's about developing communities of practice, bilateral exchange. The big request often is for the bilateral exchanges, and often they're requesting additional knowledge, which can then be sourced from existing research projects where, for example, data can be turned into usable knowledge. There's often a request for country visits or some sort of exchange like field trips. And then the least asked for is actually workshops. So I think that this is really a good space to come from when you're looking at how can research be embedded into action action on the ground. Then quickly, because I think I've still got some time, on the CDKN program, just quickly what we've learned in trying to deliver the 3 pillars, and in particular the peer learning, is that you really need to start preparing early in your program for implementation that will happen later in the program. So you start introducing the approach, you start scoping the demand, and that scoping has to be done really rigorously and in a co-creative manner. And actually the biggest thing that we found is the building of solid relationships, because that then sets the foundation for the rest of the program to be quite impactful. So with that, Julio, I think that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Shehnaaz. And yeah, thank you to all the presenters. I think we've demonstrated some of the kind of interesting approaches and processes that have been done in the past. And I know that a lot of these points are going to be kind of followed up within the breakout groups. And that is what we're going to be going into next. So we're going to have a breakout session now. And we'd really like to use the breakout session to kind of answer this overarching question for the webinar, which is what are the common strengths across the programs or projects that we need to be taking forward? And I guess also the flip side of that, or what are some of the points that we don't want to take forward? So we split up the breakout groups to answer the following 3 questions. What are we learning about effective approaches to research uptake and knowledge brokering? How can uptake and brokering be integrated into the very beginning of the projects so that we don't face lag effects where impact happens after the project closes? And what are the opportunities and limits of focusing on knowledge products as a means to achieve impact? So we'd really like everyone to share some of the learning from the programs that you've worked on from your personal experiences, and urge you to focus on more of the solutions and what we need to do next, rather than just exploring the kind of issue space and just describing what the problems are. We're going to be using Padlet during the breakouts, and this is essentially a virtual sticky notes if you've never used it before. The link to the Padlets will be shared by the facilitators. To the facilitators, please remember to click the record button. And to everyone, please add in your thoughts and comments and questions to the Padlet during this breakout. On the bottom right-hand side of the Padlet page, there's a little pink circle with a plus sign on it. If you click on there, the sticky note will come up. You can add your information in there. Please add your name into the note as well. And there's also a like button and a comment button on each of the sticky notes. So feel free to comment and like each other's posts. And then just because of the size of the group at the moment, we're going to have to do a little bit of reorganizing for the breakout groups, so please just be patient with us while we reallocate some people towards the groups. Karen, you can take us over now. Okay, it seems like most of us are back in. So welcome back to the final session. I hope that everyone found the discussions during the breakouts to be provocative and exciting. I know the session that I was in, there's some very valuable points coming up and really kind of provocative things that need to be taken forward. So with that, we're going to take the next 20 minutes odd, and I'd like to invite our facilitators to provide a brief point on either what do we want to or what do we not want to take forward into future programs. Once you've provided your feedback, please can you send me a one-liner so that we can add it into the document that's being shared. So with that, Georgina, you can go first.
Actually, Marie-Eve and I were in the same group, and she led the facilitation since I'd spoken earlier. So maybe I'll let Marie-Eve have the first word.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Yeah, we had a very interesting conversation in our group, and actually, I'll focus on one point that actually that was voted for more on our Padlet, and maybe just comment on one other aspect is that a thing we shouldn't do is actually to put the burden of uptake solely on the Southern partners in international consortia, because this leads to Northern partners continuing to publish academic papers and Southern partners doing the labor of pursuing impact, which is less recognized. And I think overall, like that, there was a very interesting discussion around the definition of success in research programs, and also the challenges that it represents for young researchers. On one hand, to motivate them to see a value in a career path as knowledge broker. But yeah, that whole definition in the academia of success and should be much broadened than the research uptake having much more value overall. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Eve. Can we go across then to Blane and Elaine from your group?
Sure. Maybe I'll have a go at this. We had a lot of kind of rich ideas that came out of this, and I'll just highlight a couple of them that I think jumped out. Our group was tasked with asking how can uptake and brokering be integrated into the very beginning of projects so we don't face lag effects where impact happens after a project closes. And maybe the most kind of provocative thing is that came out is, and not that provocative to be honest, but is let's not try to imagine that impact will only happen, that we can avoid impact happening after project closes. Impacts very often happen after the project closes, and that's okay. But let's make sure that we have conditions in place that can actually we have a plan for enabling and sustaining that the momentum towards impact beyond it, whether that's funding or resourcing. So the problem isn't that the impact is happening after the end of a rather arbitrary project end date, but rather that we find projects ending and no resources in place to continue the good work forward. So that emerged as being important. And then what I would say, maybe two things that emerged as kind of things we absolutely do want to take forward is this looking at the outset of the capacities of the knowledge of people who are doing that brokering at the outset, whether that's through creating baselines of capacity or self-assessments, looking at knowledge, skills, and attitudes that people are bringing to a partnership without assuming that they already know how to do all of this. And then ensuring that there is this emphasis on MEL, on monitoring, evaluation, and learning as we go, that's built in from the beginning, that embeds principles of reflective practice and an understanding of kind of what does progress towards impact look like along the way, that we continuously return to, that those are critical items that emerged.
Thanks, Blane. Over to Shehnaaz and Suzanne, your group.
Thank you, Julio. I'll go. So we had a very nice, it was a conversation, which was actually very nice. Our question was, in short, it's basically, are knowledge products the impact? And we chatted about how often your products are very much donor driven because you need them to include in your budget. You need them, and it's easier to budget that way with knowledge products. But what the learnings from a lot of the programs have been is that the process is more valuable than the product itself. So what we also spoke about was how your product is your output. And you then need to go to the next phase, which is the outcome and then the impact. And all this needs to be designed into your project itself. And there needs to be quite a bit of engagement with the donor around this because it's an iterative process. And there was also the sense that the donors have been really welcoming of the shift, and that some of it has landed in, for example, the Met Office, where they are looking at outputs in a different way and taking the longer term or the longer view. So, yeah, so that was us, Julio.
Thank you, Shehnaaz. Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of this resonates with points from, discussions that I've been having over the last couple months on the topics. And I think it really, there's, just to add something in there, it's really about building, flexible research processes so that these processes are responsive to user needs and responsive to the space that you're trying to influence. And there's really an element of project and program design that needs to come in so that we don't lock in kind of the research practice into a particular avenue. So that it can kind of evolve and emerge over time. Okay, so then with that, I would like to invite any of the participants to kind of comment and bring in any discussion points. Feel free to comment on any of the points that have been brought up from a group that you weren't in. And if there's any questions, I'll just open this up to the floor. If you look at the participants button on your bottom tab, you click that and there's a raise hand function. If you raise your hand, then we can go through the list like that. Georgina, I see your hand is up first.
Thank you. I have a comment, a sort of reflection on the group that discussed the knowledge products. It's a bit of a provocation, and I think we have to understand our position on this as we design research uptake approaches in programs. The choice, I think, is between our understanding of knowledge as a product and knowledge as a relationship, as knowledge is something that emerges through relationship. And if it's the second one, right? If knowledge is something that we develop through relationships, and this is the basis of a co-production idea, then what would the value be of any product that's disembodied or disconnected from relationships? And I guess this was part of what I was trying to say in that CARIAA framework earlier, this idea that research uptake is multiple activities simultaneously, but it's fundamentally based on these sustained trusting relationships that are built over time. And in the absence of those, even the best communications in the world sort of float around in an ether. So it's a sort of a provocation, and I'm really interested in whether that group reflected on that as a sort of fundamental question about the value of knowledge products by themselves.
Thanks, Georgina. Suzanne, your hand's up next.
Yeah, I was to respond to Georgina. I think that definitely did come up very strongly that the process is more important than the product. The relationship is more important than the product. So we did look at some of the what are knowledge products still good for. Some that there are still advantages to having knowledge products if they're well targeted, if they are well thought through, and the point that Shehnaaz has there about that it's part of an interactive learning process. So it's not sort of prescribed at the beginning that you must have X number of knowledge products. But if a knowledge product emerges over time, it can be a very useful and powerful way of influencing decision makers, or of getting the impact that you're looking for. But we very much had the same feeling that the process is largely where the impact happens, and the product is generally what the donor wants to see to see that you've delivered your work, and it's like the output versus the impact, I think is the difference there between the product and the process. That would be my thoughts.
Thanks, Suzanne. I guess just to add to that then, in some of the experiences that I've had with this, the product is always embedded, or should mostly always be embedded within the engagement process. But quite often, especially in the beginning, when you're trying to kind of get things off the ground and start building those relationships, you need something tangible. So the product is often the kind of the foot in the door in order to allow you to kind of create those relationships and start building the trust and building the capacity and everything else that comes with the engagement process. Okay, so I don't see any other hands at the moment. So Blane, perhaps I'll just put this question back to you then. In terms of tracking impact, then who's best placed to track impact kind of in the long term? And I guess Georgina as well, feel free to chip in, but because this is one of those questions that I put in the beginning, Blane, and I know we've discussed this before, but it is a bit of an interesting situation where the funding ends. You can put in systems that allow kind of a sustainable process to happen, but ultimately tracking that 5 years, how does that process happen, and who's best placed for that?
Thanks for sarcastic thanks there, Julia. This is the perennial question. What do we do when we sort of stop, when the project kind of pulls up its tent and packs up its bags and heads on? And a conversation I've had ongoing with Georgina and Bruce as well. And I think one of the things that we've been suggesting to them in some of the scoping work for the CLARE program is to think of this, to not think of programs as kind of things that are existing in a vacuum, that have to have all of the resources and the tools and things inside of them, because they are always going to be temporary and kind of subject to kind of wrapping down or winding down at a given point in time, and those resources kind of being redistributed elsewhere. So one of the things that we have suggested was to say, can we have accompanying processes to these kinds of initiatives that have already as a mandate supporting some of these cross-cutting functions? Whether that's knowledge management to ensure that resources and knowledge built doesn't kind of wind down with the platform that's been set up for the length of that program, or the sort of the MEL processes that we recognize need to continue beyond the life of the program. Now, whether we embed that within a sort of a funding agency or a lead partner, I think is an open question. I believe that should be a distributed task. I believe that should be actually shared by members of a community that will continue on, that we know are going to be working on that, but that it needs support. So some kind of a cross-cutting group that is able to work with, and I look around the table here, we have this long-standing partnership between the UK and Canadian governments that I think provides a strong example of this. Could they be thinking about kind of embedding some of that capacity within their portfolio of investments, their longer term portfolio investments, to ensure that there is this handover of insights and this continued tracking beyond the wind down of FCFA or CARIAA or others, but that they give themselves a mandate not only to kind of take stock for their own internal meetings and their own internal monitoring processes, but to actually bring that back to the community beyond the life of the program. So this is isn't just about kind of an accountability check of making sure we've kind of spent the money wisely, but also of saying we owe it to the wider community to ensure that these programs we're funding kind of continue to contribute to our knowledge base, continue to contribute to our kind of collective endeavor beyond the sort of the arbitrary 2017 end date of this. So I'll pause there, and there may be responses of this isn't feasible, or how do we do that?
Sure, thanks, Blane, and apologies for throwing you under the bus like that. Georgina, you have a response?
What I'm about to say is very much my personal opinion and not an organizational starting point, which is probably making a lot of my colleagues uncomfortable as I begin this. But I think we get into a process of diminishing returns when we start investing more and more money simply to track impact after a program ends, because that can feel a bit like, why are we're trying to track that so we can tell ourselves that our program had an impact. And of course that is important. It helps us understand the ways in which the design of those programs lead to long-term impacts. But I think my suspicion is that we risk spending international development funds in places where it maybe isn't best spent. I'd rather be spending it on programs that can have an impact. And so what I would say is that one of the places that we should be investing is, or questions that we should have, instead of saying how are programs continuing to achieve impact after they end, how are relationships that have been built during those programs sustained over time after the program ends? Because if we get that right, then those impacts flow from that. And so that is something that we've thought quite a lot about, is how do we, in the program's life cycle, and we have a defined life cycle, let's say we have 5 years, in that 5 years, how can we invest the most in relationship building and trust building in ways that will be sustained when that program ends? And so that would be sort of my answer to that. We do want to track impact over longer timeframes, but I don't think it's the best place for us to focus all of our energy if we want to have an impact.
Thanks, Georgina. Okay, then I'll just put it back to the floor. I realize we have a minute left, so if there's anyone who has a burning question or point that they would like to put forward before we wrap up. Okay. Well, in that case, then I think it's quite nice to see this other point here on not putting the burden on Southern partners, because the next webinar that interactive learning session that we're going to be holding is going to be on Southern leadership and capacity development. So if you are interested in that, make sure that you've signed up for the FCFA newsletter, and just kind of be aware that this webinar is going to be coming out in the next 2 weeks. Otherwise, I think there's been a very rich discussion and a lot of things to consider and things to take forward as we go. And I just want to thank everyone for participating and being as interactive and as you have been. And I wish everyone a great day, morning, or evening further.